Hello, so on this webinar, we're going to look at drug-device combination products for the European Union market. This is designed to be very much an introductory for people who are new to combination products. Now, obviously, you may come from either a medical device or a medicinal products pharmaceutical background. So I'm going to cover in this some of the very basics of the regulations pertaining to devices and medicines. Obviously, if you work in one of those areas, you'll probably know the regulations for your area, but you may not be familiar with those for the other area. So I'm going to give a very high-level overview of drugs and device regulations in the EU, and then we'll move on to see how they apply specifically to drug-device combination products. So the first thing to bear in mind is that a combination product in the EU is regulated either as a medicine, and the EU tends to use the term medicines throughout its legislation rather than drugs, which is the US term. But bizarrely, for combination products, they do refer to them as drug device combination products rather than medicine device combination products. Anyway, these combination products are regulated as either a medicine or a device, depending on the primary mode of action of the product. So examples of combination products regulated as devices would be a device that is a medical substance is added to it, but it's not the primary function of the device. So best example I can give you here would be a drug-coated stent, where the stent is the primary mode of action. It holds an artery or a vein open, and the drug is secondary, it's ancillary, just to stop calcification in the body. An example of a combination product that's regulated as a medicine would be something like a pre-filled syringe, as illustrated in the picture, or an oxygen cylinder. So it's all down to what is the primary mode of action of that combination. Now, in order to determine what is the primary mode of action, we need to look at the definition of medicines and the definition of devices in European law. For a medicine, you can look in the directive, and it will give you a whole list of things that medicines do, and then it will say, but it has to achieve its principal intended action in or on the human body by pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic means. Okay, so that's a medicine. A device, again, has a whole list in the definition of things that the devices do, and then it qualifies that by saying, but does not achieve its principal intended action in or on the human body by pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic means, but which may be assisted in its function by such means. So it is that, is it actually functioning in the body using pharmacological, immunological, metabolic means, yes or no? If the answer is yes, it's a medicine. If it's no, it's a device. So medicines laws in the EU were modified and updated, changed in 2017 with a new medical devices regulation, sometimes often just called the MDR, and that was regulation 2017-745. It repealed 2 earlier directives, and it was implemented from the 26th of May 2021. There was a 3-year transition period that should have extended until May this year, May 2024. However, there were issues with the implementation of the new regulation, largely due to the number of what's called notified bodies, and we'll see what they are in a minute. And so the regulation itself was amended in March 2023 to extend the transition periods quite considerably. For high-risk devices, it was extended until the 31st of December 2027, and for medium and lower risk devices, it was until the 31st of December 2028. So we're still in the transition period. and it extended the validity of the certificates issued under the previous directives, which the regulation had replaced. Again, they were made indefinite until the transition period was complete. So let's look at medical devices first. Depending on the risk, medical devices are required to be classified into several classes, 4 classes, rather bizarrely labeled 1 to 3, but their class 2 is subdivided. Once approved, a medical device has to carry what's called a CE mark on the device, unless the device is not possible, and on its packaging. So these are the 4 classifications, and it's risk-based, class 1 being the lowest risk and class 3 the highest risk. So there's class 1, and class 1 itself actually is subdivided because there is a subclass for sterile class 1 products. Then there's class 2A, which is typically a syringe with an integral needle. Class 2B, an example of that would be an infusion pump. And class 3 are the highest risk devices, so something like a heart valve, an implantable defibrillator. Those would be the highest risk devices. So we have 4 classifications from 1 to 3. So let's look at this is illustrating a typical life cycle for a medical device. It starts with design, and the design is an important part of the life cycle of a device. Then obviously it has to be manufactured, it has to be placed on the market, distributed. The new medical device regulation requires post-market surveillance. Eventually it will be decommissioned and disposed. I've not put any timelines on here. There is such a vast range of things that are categorized as medical devices, all the way from sort of wooden tongue depressors through to, as I say, implantable defibrillators, that the life cycle timings will be quite varied for depending on the type of medical device it is. Is it a class 1 or a class 3? Now, within medical device world, there are 3 key players in the European Union: the manufacturer, the competent authority, and something called a notified body. And I'll deal with each of these in turn. The manufacturer designs, manufactures, packages and labels, and is responsible for the post-marketing surveillance of the device. And they're the manufacturer, even if they contract out some or all of these operations to a third party, they still have the legal responsibility. So that's the role of the manufacturer. The device competent authority, and as I said, if every EU member state will have a device competent authority, their only role, they do not get involved with the manufacturers. They merely approve, assess and approve, and what's called designate notified bodies. And it's the notified bodies that have all of the interactions with the manufacturers. So all that the device competent authority does is approve these notified bodies. The notified body will have a scope associated with their designation, and that scope could be across all 3 classes of the devices, or it may only be for a limited number of classes. So the scope of the classification or the designation of the medical device can vary. So what does the notified body do? Well, the notified body actually is a certification organization. And what the law says is the competent authority of a member state designates to carry out the assessment of conformity to the requirement of the relevant regulation. So they do all the work. It's, if you like, the competent authority has subcontracted all of the responsibility to this notified body. These notified bodies are usually private sector companies, and they are independent of the device manufacturer. Obviously, that's important. But a manufacturer can choose any of the notified bodies, and there are several dozen of these across Europe, And as I say, one of the things that the device manufacturer has to do is make sure that the notified body is actually designated to act on the devices that the type of device they've got, i.e. the right classification. And so the EU competent authorities must ensure that the notified bodies have the competence to carry out their duties, including all of the technical knowledge. So that is what happens is the competent authority assesses the notified body assesses the manufacturer. And what we see as we go up the different classifications, the risk classifications of medical devices, is that at the very lowest end for many class 1 devices, it's a self-declaration. The manufacturer does not need to actually have any involvement or very little involvement with a notified body in order to get a CE mark. They will be audited by the notified body to make sure they have a quality system. But as you go up the classifications into class 2 and eventually up to class 3, the manufacturer will have a lot more involvement with the notified body. So the notified body will assess the design and the manufacturing controls for the highest risk products. So they go right back through to the design, whereas in the middle, they might just assess the manufacturing controls. So the level of notified body involvement increases as the risk associated with that device increases. On this slide, again, it just illustrates the notified body process. The first thing, it is the manufacturer's responsibility to check that the notified body is able to assess, and obviously the notified body has a requirement to make sure that they are designated to be have the sufficient designation to be able to act for that device, and they will conduct site audits. They will review the product, and for the highest risk devices, they will carry out a clinical review to make sure that the product actually does work. Now, if we move across now to the medicines, the life cycle of a medicine is quite different. It will start typically with research and development in a laboratory, trying to identify something to address a particular disease state. In the historically, they've been largely chemicals that have acted on the body. Today, many of these things are biologic, that are actually trying to alter natural pathways within the body, even a gene therapy perhaps to repair something that's not working properly in the body and get it to work properly. Those research programs can take many, many years, and I put a time frame on here of sort of 4 to 10 years. Once you have what's considered to be a reasonable candidate, you then go into what's called preclinical development. The important thing is, long before it's given to any human being, that you do testing to try and make sure that it is not poisonous, not toxic. So this preclinical development stage is often referred to as the toxicological stage, where you're looking at the pharmacology. Your really main concern is with the safety of the drug. If all of that goes well, and as I said, it can take anything up to 3 years at this stage, then you move on to clinical development. And you have to apply to a government before you can actually start that clinical development. And that's when you actually start giving it to people. And these are what's called clinical trials, and they're split into 4 phases. Phase 1 is a very small number of people. You start off with a single patient, and you may build up to maybe as many as 6 or 10, maybe a dozen patients, but relatively small number of patients. And you're primarily concerned with, is it safe? You're looking at what's happening in the body, and is it safe? Are you getting any really nasty adverse reactions? Phase 2 is then, you're always concerned with safety, so you could always continue monitoring safety. But you're going in phase 2, going to start to see, well, is it having the effect on the body that you want it to have? So that's looking at efficacy. And then in phase 3, you're continuing to do that, and now you're really trying to get statistical evidence that it is actually effective. You might compare it with another drug. You might compare it with a placebo, which is something that looks like the product but actually has nothing in, and to see whether it's better than nothing. And at phase 3, you've got a lot more patients. You might have anywhere from a few hundred to 10,000 patients, a lot more people, just enough to get the statistical evidence you need to show it's both safe and effective. A phase 4 study is one that's carried on after the product is marketed. So you have to put all of that information that you've gained during the preclinical development and during the clinical trials into then what's called a marketing authorization application before you can commercialize it. That whole process can take anywhere from 10 to 20 years. So it's a very long life cycle. And the other thing to point out is that the number of products that start at the top of that life cycle, if say of 100, only 1 or 2 ever make it through to be commercialized. There is a high rate of attrition because they get eliminated, either because they prove to be unsafe. One of the things that's looked for in safety is a risk-benefit equation. There will always be side effects with every medicine. Are the side effects so severe that they outweigh the benefit, or does the benefit outweigh the side effects? So that's one of the things the regulators will look at with any medicine when they're assessing it. So if we look at the regulatory controls across this life cycle, breaking it down a little more, for the tox studies, the toxicological studies, the tests on animals that are done at the preclinical stage, we have in Europe good laboratory practice legislation. For the conduct of the clinical trials, we have good clinical practice. For the manufacture, we have good manufacturing practice, and that kicks in as soon as you start to give it to people. So at the clinical phase, we have good distribution practice. The published guidance only covers the commercial, but there are separate guidelines on for the distribution of products for clinical studies. And then we have what is called post-marketing surveillance in the medical device world. In the drug world, we call it pharmacovigilance. And again, that starts as soon as you start to give it to people and continues throughout the life cycle. All of those regulations and guidance require the companies to have a quality system, just as the medical device companies are required to have a quality system. Okay, so now looking at the controls of medicinal products or drug products in the EU, obviously, company cannot decide that they're going to experiment on people, which is what a clinical trial is, and therefore the government has to give permission. So you have to give all of that preclinical toxicological information and say, can we start to administer this to people prior to commencing clinical trials? And then again, you have to make another application to the government prior to commencing commercial sales. And you need a separate authorization for each product or each variant of a product. So for investigational medicinal products, as they're called, that's when you're doing a clinical trial. It's not surprisingly called a clinical trials authorization. So you apply. Now, here, unlike medical devices, you apply directly to the competent authority. There are no notified bodies for medicines. You are dealing the manufacturer is dealing directly with the competent authority. And in the EU, for clinical trials, now you apply electronically to the European Medicines Agency via a portal that is called the Clinical Trials Information System, or the acronym known as by the acronym CTIS. For commercializing a medicine, again, you have generated all that information in your clinical trials and in your preclinical studies. That all goes into what's called a marketing authorization application, sometimes called a dossier that you produce. It's a lot. These days, you provide it electronically, and that's assessed on the basis of safety, efficacy, and quality. So obviously, I've talked about the risk-benefit equation. That really is the safety. Efficacy, does it work? Have you got statistical proof either that it's better than an existing medicine or better than nothing, a placebo, to prove it is effective. And it doesn't have to be 100% effective. Not all medicines, in fact, very few medicines are effective in everybody. A cancer drug that is effective in 40% of cancer patients would get a marketing authorization because it's effective in 40% of the patients, as long as you can prove that. And obviously, you have to show you can manufacture it of the correct quality. So who do you apply to? You apply again to the competent authority. They have the permission, they have the legal responsibility for making the assessment, whereas in the device, that assessment is conducted by the notified body, and they have the power to grant, refuse, and they can also revoke or vary the license, the manufacturing authorization, after you've received it. In the EU, as I said, there is a subset of products that you have to apply centrally to the European Medicines Agency, but for the vast majority of products, you apply to national competent authorities for a license. And there are various mechanisms for a license issued in one country to be recognized by other countries. In the European Union, there are also legal controls on the site that makes the medicines and the distribution of those medicines. So the product manufacturing and importation sites, and by importation, it means from outside of the European Union, and warehousing and distribution, again, have to have licenses from the government, from the competent authorities. For the manufacturer, that is called, not surprisingly, a manufacturing import authorization, and they're issued by the national competent authority. You do not apply for them centrally to the EMA. And in order to get one and maintain one, you have to show adherence with what's called good manufacturing practice, and that includes the requirement for quality systems, and you are inspected typically every 2 to 3 years by the national competent authority, up front before you get given it for the first time, and then every 2 to 3 years in order to maintain it. And you get given a GMP compliance certificate. Very similarly, for the distribution, there are controls on the wholesalers, and it's called a wholesale distribution authorization. Again, it's a site-specific authorization issued by the national competent authority, and you have to demonstrate compliance with good distribution practice guidance, and you will have an initial inspection to get your wholesale distribution authorization in the first place, and then an inspection typically every 2 to 3 years in order to maintain it, and you get a WDA wholesale dealer's certificate at the end of it. Medical devices do not achieve their principal intended action in or on the human body by pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic means, whereas medicines do. All devices have to have a CE mark, whereas each medicine must have a marketing authorization. Many Class 1 devices, the manufacturer self-declares conformity with the regulation. All other classes need a notified body assessment to get the CE mark. For medicines, either if it's there's a small subset of medicines that have to go centrally to the European Medicines Agency, but the majority, vast majority of medicines will be assessed by the national competent authority, and you have to submit what's called a marketing authorization application dossier. Both manufacturers of medicines and devices have to have a quality system. The device manufacturers have to meet ISO 14485 and are audited by a notified body. The manufacturers must comply, of a medicine must comply with good manufacturing practice, which includes the requirement to have a quality system, and they are inspected by their national competent authority. So each EU member state has a competent authority, and the local authority will carry out the inspection for a medicine. So, having introduced a lot about medicines and devices, let's have a look at combination products. The medical device regulation of 2017 introduced changes, and it introduced those changes by varying actually the law for medicinal products, which is currently 2001/83 in the EU. And the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, has recently updated and very significantly revised their question and answer document on implementing the medical device regulation for combination products. The latest update was published in May 2024. So it talks about the two different types of combination products. And I'll deal first where the medical device is the principal mode of action. So here, the medicine is ancillary to the device, and therefore it will be regulated as a device, and it will go through the notified body process. If it's a higher risk device, it has to have the CE mark applied. And the change introduced by the new medical device regulation was that you had to have at least a competent authority scientific opinion on the safety and quality of the medicine before a notified body can issue a conformity assessment certificate for the device. In practice, many of the medicines that will be used may well already have marketing authorizations because they will be medicines in their own right. Using the example I used earlier of a heparin-coated stent, the stent is the principal mode of action. It would perhaps be put into an artery that's collapsed, and the principal mode of action will be physical to hold the artery open. But you would add heparin to stop the body growing over it, so to speak. The process is called calcification. Heparin is also approved as a medicine to be given as an injection post-operatively to stop your blood clotting, etc. So it will already have a marketing authorization, and therefore that would be fairly simple to get a scientific opinion from a national competent authority that issued the marketing authorization for the product. It would be perhaps more complicated if that medicine that's been added to your device as an ancillary action that did not have a marketing authorization separately for the medicine. But again, you would need to get a scientific opinion from a national competent authority before the medical device notified body could issue the conformity assessment. Okay, so now let's have a look where the medicine is the principal mode of action. And these are referred to generally as integral drug device combination products. And the guidance gives them the little symbol IDDC, integral drug device combination products. And there are two types of integral drug device combination products. One is a device that incorporates as an integral part a medicinal product where the action of the substance is principal and not ancillary. And so that would be, for instance, a drug-eluting intrauterine contraceptive device. Here, the device is a carrier for the drug. It is merely to put the drug into the right part of the body. The mode of action is on the body is the medicine, and therefore it is regulated as a medicine. The other type of integral drug device is a device which is intended to administer a medicinal product. And here we're talking about something like a pre-filled syringe, a pen device, or an inhaler for an inhalation product like an asthma treatment. So again, these are both integral drug device combinations because the medicinal product, the drug, is what's principally acting on the body. Now, the change that the medical device regulation introduced here was that the product had to have a conformity assessment for the device part at the same time as you applied for the marketing authorization of the product. Now, as I've already said, for a class 1 non-sterile device, that is usually the manufacturer's self-declaration of conformity. For all other classes of device, this will be a certificate or opinion from a notified body. And that was a change in the 2017 device regulation that came into effect in 2021. So the EMA recommends that the National Competent Authority strongly recommend that you submit that declaration of conformity with the marketing authorization application, which means from a practical point of view, of course, you've got to be planning for that way in advance. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And that was a big change, and it caught a lot of companies out. If not submitted with the initial application, it obviously must be submitted before any opinion can be given on the marketing authorization application, which can therefore quite significantly delay. If there is a long delay in giving that notified body EU certificate, that conformity assessment to the competent authority, then that will delay the decision on whether to give you a marketing authorization. So what happens if you've got one on the market and you need to make a change? When do you and who do you need to get involved? If you want to make a change to a medicine, you always have to submit what's called a variation to your marketing authorization. And so obviously you may need to update your conformity assessment as part of that variation for an integral drug device combination. So for an additional or full replacement of a device, then you need a completely new assessment. For a change to a device or a part of it, for class ones, then the manufacturer must update their declaration of conformity. If the device has a medical device regulation certificate or an opinion from a notified body, then the notified body should assess the change and, if required, issue a new or supplemental certificate or opinion. So again, that was a change that was introduced by the medical device regulation. It is the responsibility of the marketing authorization holder to determine when a new or updated notified body assessment is needed, but generally they would do that obviously in consultation with the notified body, and undoubtedly the national competent authority would take a view on that, and if they thought you hadn't had the right level of notified body scrutiny, would undoubtedly take that into account and inform you of that as they scrutinize the variation. And again, if you haven't got the right paperwork to go with your variation, it could easily delay the approval of that variation quite significantly, because it is ultimately the marketing authorization holder obviously has to submit the variation on the basis on and assess as part of that variation any impact on safety, quality, or efficacy. The other type of device that may be associated with a medicinal product is what's called a co-packaged or referenced device. So the medicinal product and the medical device here are separate items, but are combined for the administration of the medicines. So they can either be what's called co-packaged, that is, they literally are packaged together and supplied to you together, or they may be able to obtain them separately. So you might have a refillable pen or injector that uses cartridges. The medicinal product manufacturer will make the cartridges and fill them, but those cartridges may be able to be used in a number of different pen devices to actually administer the injection. And in these circumstances, the devices that are either co-packaged or referenced have to have a certificate or declaration of conformity, and therefore must carry the CE marking. So obviously, as I said, the recommendation is that you have all of the relevant or agreements from both a notified body and all of the other clinical trial data that you need at the time you submit the marketing authorization application. And you've got a plan for that right from the start of the project. And you need to understand that it's going to be a combination product right in your target product profile at the whole planning of bringing this product to market. And it's entirely possible that the device associated with your product may well change as you go through the life cycle of that medicinal product. For instance, you might have a product that is administered as an intramuscular injection. Now, at phase 1 in the clinical trial process, where you have a very small number of patients, probably 10 or less patients, you're likely to have that administered. The product will be packaged in a vial, and that will probably be administered using a completely separate syringe. And therefore, you've got then a one drug device combination. By the time you get to phase 2, you might want to have it administered, because it's easier in the clinic to administer it as a pre-filled syringe. And that may be for convenience. It may be because it enables blinding of the clinical trial. So there's another combination product there. And by phase 3 and commercial, you may actually, for patient convenience, want to actually be using an injector pen device, which is often and usually more convenient for patients. So you've actually got different drug device combinations as you go through the development of the product. Each of those obviously needs to be assessed. The different devices need to have the right assessments provided and submitted. And also, obviously, it's possible that by administering it differently, you can actually impact the efficacy and potentially the safety of the product actually in the human body. So you've got a lot of factors to consider. So the very strong advice is, think about how you're going to do this right up front. I always use the phrase that failing to plan is planning to fail. And failure to plan properly for combination products can cost you huge amounts of time and delay bringing a product to market. And obviously, if you want to change the device, as we've said, again, that can have significant consequences. So those changes you've gone through during the clinical trial stages, and if you want to change it later on in the commercial phase, always have to be assessed, because they can have effects on the medicine. They can affect the pharmacokinetics. You will have different, almost certainly different product contact surfaces. So you have to do what's called extractables and leachable studies. And so, yes, different product contact surfaces means you have different extractable and leachable considerations to make. So to summarize this brief introduction to combination products in the EU, medical devices are classified by risk, class 1 being the lowest risk, class 3 being the highest risk. Devices are required to have CE marking. Medicines require a marketing authorization to commercialize, and combination products are regulated as either a medicine or a device, depending on their primary mode of action.